Well, we tell you about the Ebony Tate and her family. They were wrongfully targeted by Chicago police. They were awarded $5.7 million in damages. Joining us right now is the attorney for the family, Zach Hofield. Zach, glad to have you here.
Roland, good to be with you.
This is insane. So an informant gave them the wrong address?
Yeah. The informant, the Chicago Police Department had bad information. There were actually two search warrants they obtained, one for 5033 and one for 5039. Buildings were right next to each other, and the informant told them that the individual they were looking for lived in both residences, which, obviously raised some questions as to whether that's actually the case.
And so walk us through, I may remember this case. I mean, my goodness, these folks are at the house and next thing you know, it's like a war zone.
Exactly. And, it's undisputed that this family of six, a mom, a grandma, and four children, ages 13, 11, 8, and 4, weren't doing anything wrong. No evidence of any crime or wrongdoing found at their home. They were just everyday citizens minding their own business. And there is a Chicago police SWAT team that executed these simultaneous search warrants in these two buildings. And rather than knock and announce and wait, as required, give the family an opportunity to come to the door voluntarily and answer, they didn't knock and announce. They did what's called a dynamic entry, which is fast moving, hard charging, and in many ways is very bad practice, dangerous practice. Detonated noise flash diversionary devices or flashbang grenades outside the home, which has a very startling effect, and just came in guns blazing in terms of guns pointed directly at Ebony, the mom, and Kaya, the 4-year-old, in the living room. Miss Eason, the grandmother, comes out of her bedroom, guns pointed directly at her. And, officers are trained, you don't get to point and then decide whether something's a threat. You keep it rifle pointed at the ground. Only once you've decided that someone is a threat, you point. And this, policy and training went out the window inside the Tate home. And guns were pointed also at Imani, who's 13, and Lanaya, who's 11, Legend, who's 8. And not just for a flash of a second, but in a sustained fashion for, there were different estimates of time, but grandmother thought it was on the order of 2 to 3 minutes. Some of the kids thought it was on the order of, 30 to 45 seconds, but the jury believed it was objectively unreasonable conduct.
Absolutely crazy. So I'm glad to see this jury had some sense because that's just absolutely crazy.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. And I think the other part of the story, Roland, is that, I don't think the jury, they didn't need to find that these officers were monsters in any way. In many ways, it's a story about a failure to train and a failure of the city of Chicago to have a policy to avoid needless gun pointing at young kids who clearly pose no threat under the circumstances. Failure to properly train officers to avoid pointing guns at children who clearly pose no threat under the circumstances. And in fact, we brought what's called a Monell claim in this case against the city, alleging that they had a policy and practice of allowing their officers to use excessive force against children over this 6-year period that led up to the incident, and thus was, what was causing the officers to use this unreasonable force against the children. And the jury found against the city on that claim, essentially finding that the city did have this practice that it allowed in its police department of using excessive force against kids without holding officers accountable.
Absolutely. Zach Hofield, we appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Good to be with you, Roland. Take care.
All right.